Welcome, and thanks for joining us for the Rock Solid Apologia podcast, where we discuss Christian apologetics, worldviews, and so much more. We're so glad that you're listening with us today. Feel free to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to keep up with all the latest news over at RSA. Now, on to today's podcast episode.
Welcome to the world's one and only apologetic satire podcast. I'm Will England, editor-in-chief of Rock Solid Apologia, and I'm in person today with Dr. Jeff Myers, the president of Summit, for the first ever in-person interview with Rock Solid Apologia. Dr. Jeff is the president of Summit Ministries. Over the last 20 years, Dr. Jeff Myers has become one of America's most respected authorities on youth leadership, development, and he has equipped thousands of people to champion the Christian worldview, in addition to authoring Grow Together, Cultivate, and Hand Off. Welcome to the world's one and only apologetic satire site, Dr. Jeff.
I love it. I think your show is really funny. I've read some of the articles, and I love what you're doing.
It's been fun to try and do like a new approach, because as we were looking at it, it's like we could try and do what you're doing or what Sean McDowell's doing, and we're not going to do it better. So why not try and have a bit of a new, different approach?
Well, David Noble, the founder of Summit Ministries, always used to say, "Look, if you don't laugh, you'll cry." So
Right.
you might as well laugh.
Right. Chesterton said, "Always be comic in tragedy. What else can you do?"
Good point.
He also said, "The test of true religion is whether or not you can joke about it."
Good point. I love it. I love it.
So
Good. Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
Not sure if there will be too much satire today, because Marxism is pretty serious, but I wanted to talk about the history of Marxist thought and also how Marxists think about history.
Yep. Great.
So we begin in London, 1848, with a man named Karl Marx. He's about to publish a pamphlet which will become the Communist Manifesto, a document that will change the course of history. What do we need to know about Marx? And what are the key ideas contained in the document he's about to publish?
Well, Marx was a scholar primarily. So he was not going out to factories and examining the conditions and therefore writing about how to remedy them. We actually have no information that Karl Marx ever was in a factory and actually saw the working conditions of the people he was writing about. He went to the library, the British Library, and that's where he studied. That's where he wrote. He was very good at looking up statistics and things like that, and he just put all that information together, sort of in the the old Aristotelian tradition that if it makes sense to you, then you don't have to actually explore it in reality, because therefore, if it makes sense to you, it's true. So Karl Marx was a personally a nasty guy. He was unkempt. He was famously averse to bathing. He was terrible to his wife. He impregnated their housekeeper. And he was always just asking for money. He was terrible to his parents, squandering their inheritance. Just not a very pleasant kind of guy. But the communists loved him because he was a thinker outside of the box. In academics, they're always looking for that. Who's the person who transcends the way we usually talk about this? And Karl Marx was that guy.
So Karl Marx is not the kind of man you'd want to have lunch with.
You wouldn't want to have lunch with him, but he's the kind of guy that if you're trying to understand the flow of history, you might get a real charge out of looking at the way he frames it. It's what he did to politics and economics and philosophy what Charles Darwin did with science.
So, speaking of flow of history, how did Karl Marx view history?
Yeah, well, some people view history as linear. We started as simple cell organisms and we're moving our way toward perfection. There are a lot of people, a lot of the books that are in my collection here are from people who say, things used to be really great and they're just getting worse and worse all the time. Other people like Oswald Spengler, had a sort of a cyclical view of history. Marx's idea was, take Hegel, George Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel, his idea of the dialectic, that you have the thesis, the antithesis, a clash, out of that forms a new synthesis, that the process of history is this process of experimentation. And then he said, now, Hegel's idea of the oversoul, the spirit, that's all bunk. He said only Marx was an atheist before he was a communist. Only the material world exists. So take all of the spiritual stuff out of Hegel and recognize that the flow of history is all about the economic relationships between people, and you will have a way of understanding everything. That's what he believed, and that's what he taught. He was quite extensive in the way he put all of those thoughts together. The collected works of Marx and Lenin now is vast.
So there's this notion in Marxism of dialectical materialism. What is dialectical materialism and how does this relate?
Well, that idea of Hegel's, the dialectic so in economic terms, for instance, you have a feudalism that develops. It seems to make sense to people. The people who work the land have no ownership relationship to the land. They're just, they're just serfs. That seems to make sense to the people who are making all of the rules. But then the workers rise up and they form some sense that we as workers have a bond that enables us to have political or social or economic power. And so then there's a clash between those two, and out of it emerges capitalism. And eventually there'll be a clash between capitalism and socialism, and that'll emerge moving more toward capitalism. So he believed there was an end to history, and the end to history was communism. That's the best it can be. Only the material world exists. Only what happens during your lifetime matters. When you die, you die. There's nothing more. So the best you can do is have relationships between workers that don't permit the oppression of the dominant classes as in the past.
Will this history come about in Marxist thought, or is it up in the air?
Well, that's a really significant point because the idea of the dialectic is no one really knows where history is going to go. No one knows when the thesis and the antithesis clash, what kind of a synthesis will emerge. So, but if everything is determined, which is why, you look at Marx and why he was an atheist, his atheism, without his atheism, nothing about his Marxist perspective makes any sense. Because if we have free will, then yes, you would never know where history is going to go. You just do your best to try to move it in the direction that you think it should go. But if it's determined and we don't really have free will, then, Marx's guess as to what the outcome is going to be is as good as anybody else's.
So Marxism is contingent upon economic determinism.
Absolutely.
Specifically, but determinism just generally.
Determinism generally, and economics in particular, because Marx strongly believed that everything revolves around economics. You scratch any problem, it bleeds economics. It's always about the relationships, economic relationships. So even issues today, like the LGBTQ movement, he would have argued that is about economic relationships, that people are being oppressed because of their sense of their own sexuality, and there's going to have to be a revolution. The revolution will end up overthrowing the structures of society that permit the oppression, and then everything will be fine.
So everything is about economics.
Everything is about economics. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a lot of people miss that. So that's why a Marxist can talk about LGBTQ and race and all of these different things, because the only thing that matters about any of those relationships is the economic.
So let's take a brief detour with just Marxist history. Marx pioneers the Communist Manifesto. Then you have Vladimir Lenin. What do we need to know about him, and did he have any major differences with Marx?
Yes. So Marx wrote and published in the middle of the 19th century, so the middle of the 1800s. Lenin came along at the end of the 1800s. He was a scholar. He thought that you have to take Marxist principles and figure out how to turn them into a governing platform. What would this actually look like if it were to happen? And what the precursor, obviously, is you have to have a strong capitalist society. Otherwise, you have no wealth that you can take over.
Mm-hmm.
So Lenin had the opportunity to take the helm of the Russian Revolution. So this is the October 1917 revolution. His thoughts were more about the practical aspects of how do you make a revolution work. See, Karl Marx was, let's pile up all the kindling and I'm going to be the guy to light the match. Lenin was the guy who, well, okay, fine. If we've got a fire on our hands, how do we channel that energy into something that can kind of create the society that everybody's looking for?
So Lenin's figuring out how to actually implement what Marx dreamed up in his office.
And he had an impossible task in doing that. Because you think, well, okay, you've got all of the people in the population. They've all now got to be fed. They've all got to have jobs. All of the economic decisions that used to be made by individuals for their own reasons now have to be made by some kind of a centralized authority. And that's where all of the real trouble began.
So Lenin dies, and the mantle is picked up by a man named Joseph Stalin.
Right.
What do we need to know about Stalin, and did he have any major differences from Marx and or Lenin?
Yes. Well, there were two guys. They had two different perspectives. Stalin was one of them. Leon Trotsky was the other guy. And Stalin was a very pragmatic kind of person. So he had no compunction about death. And if people needed to die for the cause of the revolution to be advanced, he was fine with that. Trotsky was fine with it too. But Stalin, once he got into power, wanted to secure his power. So the revolution stops with him. Okay. So he is the dictator, he's the dictatorship of the proletariat. He's ruling on behalf of the people. That's the way he sees it. And he believed that the only way for this revolution to really succeed is for people who were revolutionaries to stop being revolutionaries and to start getting to work, forming an industrial-based society that can compete with the capitalist nations that are against them. Trotsky wanted global revolution. He just wanted the revolution to continue and continue and continue. He never wanted it to stop. Well, this is always the problem with these revolutionary movements. They end up cannibalizing themselves because you have the people who want to keep being revolutionaries and you have the people who are now in charge and they don't want anyone to revolt against them the way they revolted against the previous guys. So then they end up killing the revolutionaries. And Stalin had Trotsky killed along with hundreds of thousands of other people who he thought were either not wanting a revolution at all or were wanting to continue the revolution because he did not want any threats to his power.
It's interesting, like Lenin wanted global revolution.
Yes.
And there's a book by Giles Milton on the British effort to stop global revolution. And then there's another book by Sean McMeekin on Stalin's efforts in World War II to just expand communism.
Yes, and I think the McMeekin thesis is interesting. I haven't thought a whole lot about it. It seems like Stalin was an opportunist for sure, but usually the simplest explanation is the correct one.
Right.
There was initially a pact between the Nazis, between Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin and the Bolsheviks. They had a pact together to control the world, but the pact was doomed because, Hitler, if he needed a scapegoat, he would use the Jews. If he couldn't use the Jews, he would use the communists. If he couldn't use the communists, he would use the Jewish communists. He would, whatever it was, but the communists were always part of what was bad from his perspective. So it was inevitable that was going to change. Hitler ended up attacking Russia. Russia lost more soldiers than any other nation. He said it was 20 million. 20 million Russians were lost in that. And they've never recovered. Russia's never recovered from that population catastrophe.
And thus they felt justified after the war to take as much as they could because we lost the most, therefore we should gain the most in this.
That's right. In all of the discussions that we have records of between Churchill and Stalin and Roosevelt and later Truman, Stalin's argument always was, we have paid the highest price. So you're not going to leave us out of the settlement of these territories. They took Poland by force and then took Germany by agreement with the Americans.
So one last key figure before we focus on what these ideas did. Mao Zedong comes along in China, and he implements communism in China. Did Mao Zedong differ much from Lenin and Stalin, or was he more or less the same?
So they both start with Karl Marx, but even now, there is a tension that continues. There always was a tension between the USSR and China. That you would think that they could band together and pursue global revolution, but they didn't really do that, and I think that's good that they didn't. But so Mao's ideas, I think, differed from Lenin and Stalin. I think pretty simply just the way the West differs from the East. People in China think differently about culture and about society. So Mao was thinking, Stalin was thinking about economics, building factories, stealing technology to advance his cause and that kind of thing. And Mao was thinking about cultural stuff. So what is it that makes up a good society? And I would say both of them were equally destructive of human life. Tens of millions of people were killed by Stalin. And I say killed because some of them, you say they probably starved to death through neglect because the economic system was so atrocious. But a lot of them were intentionally starved to death. And I think the same thing was true with Mao.
Mm-hmm.
There was a civil war prior to Mao taking over, and the previous guy ended up fleeing to an island, which became Taiwan. The Republic of China still exists today, but it stands in opposition to mainland China.
Right, right. So, talked about the key figures. Former President Ronald Reagan once told a story of a woman who went into the General Secretary of the Soviet Union, at the time it was a man named Mikhail Gorbachev, and asked whether or not communism was dreamed up by a politician or a scientist. And Gorbachev said, politician, of course. And the lady said, that makes sense. A scientist would have tried it on mice first.
Right, exactly.
So,
yeah. Well, people are mice. From a Marxist worldview, there's no enduring human value. There were some people like Pavlov and a handful of other individuals who Ellis Vygotsky, who tried to figure out how there would be some sort of a recognition of what makes a human human. But essentially, if only the material world exists, then you're certainly not made in the image of God. You certainly don't have value that transcends anything else in the animal world. And if you're not cooperating with the revolution, then you're part of the problem. Your death would be a welcome relief for the world.
Do the ends justify the means in Soviet Russia or Soviet China? Is death acceptable provided we get to the end of history?
I think it was certainly during the time of Lenin, Stalin, even Stalin's successor, Khrushchev, made a lot of noise, gave a lot of speeches, and seemed to indicate that if you were against the revolution as it was represented in the Soviet state, then your life was forfeit. And certainly they acted that way. There's no question at all. So you're looking at an ideology that destroyed the lives of more people than all governments and all wars in human history combined.
Do you think that had the Middle Ages the kind of technology that we had in the 20th century, that the death rates would have been closer? Like, do you think that it was simply communism that killed more? How do you think technology, the new technology in the 20th century, played into those deaths?
Well, certainly the war technology was significant in that. But I'm wondering if the main thing that caused the doom of so many people was the fact that technology allowed evil leaders to organize themselves more efficiently.
Hmm.
I can't speak to this in the Soviet Union as much, but there is a fascinating study that was done, and it's very controversial, about IBM, which is one of the biggest computer companies, and Germany, that IBM enabled Germany to coordinate all of their records and to figure out who had Jewish heritage and to organize it all just through gathering census data that was turned in by people. And that's how they knew who to go round up. So
Interesting.
after World War II, and East Germany was communist, and you have the Stasi, they used all the available technology to spy on the population. And it's possible that up to a third of the people in that country were spies on the other two-thirds. And some people don't even, the records are all available now, but some people don't even want to look at it because they just don't want to know which of their family members was interested in turning them in to the state police. So I think something similar happened in the Soviet Union. Clearly, they wanted to develop the military technology, which helps to spark the Cold War with the United States.
It's just interesting because it is certainly true that secularism in the 20th century killed far, far more than any
Yeah,
previous age. But those previous ages also did not have the technology with which to kill. So it's just interesting looking at like the role of where does ideology play into this, and then also where does technology and just different developments in history play into this.
yeah. Well, I think you're onto something really significant. So let's say somebody develops all the military technology, they control it in the hands of a few, then they take that military technology and turn the tank turrets toward their own people, then compel them to live and act in a certain way. They weaponize their own government against the people who they're supposed to be serving in this revolution. That always happens. It always happens in these communist societies. I can't think of an example where it didn't.
And that's much more rare in earlier history. There are quote unquote genocides, but you don't see governments turning on their own people in mass like that. I suppose you could say that the Albigensian Crusade to wipe out the Cathars in early 1200s um, could kind of fit because it was in France and led by French. But that, I mean, that's an exception, and it was outside forces, influences. You don't see, for instance, King Henry III deciding he's going to wipe out a significant portion of his population.
Right. And he would have had to have had the agreement of his fellow royals,
Mhm.
which was very difficult to get. And he would have had to have some kind of a technology that was the game changer. There was nothing with the equivalent of a 2,000-pound bomb. There's nothing like a tank that if you pull it into a neighborhood, everybody in that neighborhood is going to do what you say because one shell will blow apart an entire building. There was nothing like that.
Right.
So even the size of the armies that took the field in those Middle Age battles that you're referring to were significantly smaller. And those populations that were attacked should not have been that vulnerable. There's a lot of it. There's a lot of interesting stuff about what the responsibility of a city-state should have been. So Carthage should not have been destroyed in the way that it was. That Constantinople should not have been destroyed in the way that it was. It's fascinating to look at. But you're right. You're right. Technology can produce great good or great harm.
So let's talk a little bit about how we communicate, especially to people my age. the realities of Marxism. Vladimir Lenin once asked, "How can you have revolutions without firing squads?" And I was in a class that was we had one assignment, which was to write a poem about our chosen revolution. And my class was entirely Marxists. Um, they hated that label, but I asked them like, where would you differ with Marx? And they
Wow.
didn't really know where they differ with
Mhm.
Marx. So it's like, I'm not trying to be insulting. It's just technically speaking,
Yeah.
Lenin understood revolution better than my classmates did, I think. How can we communicate with, especially people our age, um, that Lenin was probably right when he says that revolution um, requires firing squads, and that revolution is not just this peaceable, you know, I have a new idea, I'm going to make the world better kind of thing.
I think you're making a really great point. It, it, it it's a tricky argument to make because you can't say to your classmates, if you had your way, you would start shooting people.
One of my
Uh,
classmates did say that,
oh,
actually.
yikes.
He said that if we shot all the rich people, you had an all-powerful squad of people with AK-47s, and you had 100 years of what he called chaotic necessity and complete and total bloodshed, that would solve the problem. And the problem why communism has never worked before was because it wasn't global. It was only localized.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Classic.
yeah, it's what he's talking about is called the 20th century. It actually happened,
Uh-huh.
and your classmate is factually proven wrong by the way events transpired in reality. But I'll tell you one way I see it. If you always know you've got somebody who's got Marxist presuppositions if they're on campus and they say, I'm not going to let you speak because if I did, that would be to platform misinformation. So if the cancel culture came out of that Marxist mindset, we're not going to have a debate about this because if we have a debate, then I'm admitting that your ideas should be placed on the same stage as my ideas. No Marxist believes that that's the case. Marxists do not believe that they will prevail in the world of ideas with a free and fair exchange of thoughts. They want no free and fair exchange of thoughts because the other people who they're up against are evil. They're evil. They're the ones who have rigged everything, developed the economic structure for their own benefit, taken over the government for their own benefit. You would never debate them. You would try to defeat them. That's where cancel culture came from. And it's kind of a new example of a firing squad. What's worse, to end somebody's life or to destroy their reputation so thoroughly that for the rest of their lives they're humiliated?
And it's so interesting from a Marxist deterministic perspective that we shouldn't let people talk because you're going to win anyway if you take their determinism seriously. Like it shouldn't
Yeah.
matter what we capitalists have to say
Yeah.
or what we free market people have to say. It's just fascinating in my class because they were all super nice people. They were not pro cancel culture at all. I mean, they were actually very respectful and they wanted me to share my ideas. But it was like, folks, I don't think you see, like, if you guys take power, where these ideas lead to.
Yeah. A lot of the books I have in my library are about what actually took place. And, some of the best evidence that your classmate is wrong, I think comes from the guy Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
Hmm.
So he was a, prize winning, no, uh, activist, Soviet, former Soviet citizen who blew the whistle. And his Gulag Archipelago, it's not that thick. And every page is two or three different stories or examples of how the cynicism that develops when you try to actually put communism into practice prevents it from ever succeeding. This would be no surprise to somebody with a biblical worldview. From a biblical worldview, you would say, well, human beings have a sin nature, that if the power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, as Lord Acton put it, you would have no problem recognizing that if you just put one or two people in charge, they will become corrupt. But the Marxists never, they never believed that. And so they always ended up blundering into these situations where it wasn't just the people who were leading at the national level. These local communists who were supposed to control things just ended up being freakishly sadistic in everything they did.
I had an argument with my teacher, and I thought the absolute world of this teacher because she was an amazing teacher. She was also a consistent liberal in and of the sense that she thought that everybody had their own truth and that everybody's truth was equally true and applied that to free speech, which worked out.
Yeah.
But she and I got into a discussion about what happens when one person has all the power. And she said something to the effect of, Will, I don't believe you do terrible things in power. And I looked at the rest of my class and like, I don't trust myself that way. I just start oppressing you all because absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it's just interesting the optimism in human nature that leads to such absolute human catastrophes and leads to total pessimism about human nature. It's just an interesting paradox within Marxism.
Well, look at the French Revolution as another example, just to pull it away, because Marxism it's charged. When you talk about it, people get upset. Not that many people have an attachment to the French Revolution, so you could talk about it a little more openly.
Uh-huh.
But what happened in the French Revolution? 40,000 people who were all of the elites of the society were guillotined. Blood literally ran in the streets of Paris. And after all of those people were guillotined, did the bloodlust end? No, it didn't. The people who initiated the French Revolution ended up on the guillotine themselves because they were deemed by the subsequent generation of revolutionaries to be insufficiently pure. So that's what I mean when these movements cannibalize themselves. It's the Trotsky versus Stalin thing. Are we going to have an oppressive state or are we going to continue the revolution? And Trotsky says, we're going to continue the revolution. And now you are the oppressor and we're going to revolt against you. Well, who's going to win? And that's that power play. The one who has the assassins, the one who has all the military, the one who has the central authority who everybody's terrified of, that person's always going to win. So the oppressors rise to the surface. The people who are corrupt get squeezed out of the middle to the top.
Right. So I wanted to pivot a little bit and talk a little bit about a Christian response to Marxist ideas and some Christian views of history/society. So Herman Bavinck, the great Dutch neo-Calvinist, once said, because the
I've heard of
gospel,
that guy.
he's amazing.
Are you a fan?
I've not read enough of him to be sure, but I really like what I've read of him so far.
So your mentor,
Spurgeon,
Noah, I know, is very, who's actually sitting here in the background. We should just go ahead and say that. But
yeah, Noah loves Bavinck, is converting our entire class to Bavinckians, neo-Calvinism.
Yeah.
Um,
No, I'm good with it. Fascinating guy. Okay, yeah, go ahead and give us that quote.
Because the gospel is exclusively directed to the redemption of sin, it leaves all natural relationship alone. It is in principle opposed to all socialism, communism, anarchism, which after all never oppose sin, but by their denial of the fall identify sin with nature, unrighteousness with the very institution of the family, and the state, and therefore creation with the fall. For the same reason, the gospel shuns every revolution that arises from the principle, since by the overthrow of everything, a revolution makes no distinction between nature and sin, and eradicates the good and the bad. The gospel, on the other hand, always works reformationally. So going off of what Bavinck says, what is a Christian view? You see problems in society. How is a Christian to change society?
Well, there are a couple of big differences with the Marxist worldview.
Mhm.
One, and that quote mentions it, we've already talked about it on the show, is the recognition that there is such a thing as a sin nature. Now, a Marxist would look at that and say, you're so dour, you're so negative. If you look at you in your view of sin in society, you're always putting a negative spin on things. Turn your frown upside down, and let's have a good old-fashioned revolution. But the understanding of sin causes people to proceed in power with caution and to divide power. The American founders put in place the separation of powers. They did that based on their observation of what they saw Moses do with the ancient Hebrews. Okay, so that's one big thing. Another thing is that Marxism advocates a collective salvation rather than an individual salvation. When you look at the admonishments about spiritual growth in the New Testament, they're addressed to groups. Here's the church, read the letter from Paul or Peter, but the admonishment to grow in Christ and to have a relationship with Christ applies to each person separately from the group. Although they are in the group, they are a body together. So individual salvation means that every person is responsible to be reconciled to God and then to bear witness to that reconciliation in everything they do in their domain of influence. Collective salvation is different. No one individual is responsible for making a difference. It's the mass of the people. And if anyone, gets out, if they squirt out and they're separate, that threatens the salvation of all of the rest. So that person must be brought back into control. So in those two ways, sin nature and the individual versus collective salvation, I think you see a huge difference. And that becomes the way we make a difference in society. So you're an individual, you recognize that what Jesus said in John 8:32 is true. If you follow my teachings, you'll be my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. You're free from that bondage to sin, and then you're able to do whatever it is that God's called you to do, recognizing that Jesus is the truth. And those people, documented in history, are the ones who literally changed the course of history in a positive direction.
A wonderful example of that is William Wilberforce,
Great
the Clapham Society in Great Britain that abolished the slave trade in Britain without a civil war and without lives lost.
Yes.
Eric Metaxas wrote a wonderful book called Amazing Grace on Wilberforce.
It's a tremendous book.
abolition.
And everything that Wilberforce was doing in culture and society, other people like Robert Boyle were doing in science.
Mhm.
People were doing the same thing in the arts and in architecture and all of these different areas, making innovations. The innovations in art and architecture allowed you to have rooms like this one where we have a big window and the building doesn't collapse.
Yeah.
You look back at those old castles, the windows they couldn't figure out how to make the windows bigger than this. Well, they bring in light. The whole idea of the architecture for chapels and churches changed the way people understood their relationship to light and to the gospel. And architecture became formative in the way Christianity developed and grew. There's so many examples of that. Everybody who's watching, whatever your area is you work on plumbing fixtures, you work on electrical fixtures, you work on concrete, you sell things in a store, you make things, you serve people, you do their accounting or whatever it is. All of those things done recognizing that Jesus is the truth become transformative.
Abraham Kuyper has this quote that I'm going to paraphrase, but there's not a square inch of creation that the lordship of Christ does not cry mine.
Yeah. Kuyper is worth looking at. He's a little hard to access in reality, but the basic idea of it is pretty straightforward. You have the family, you have the church, you have the state as dominant spheres of society. And the balance between those spheres is what makes for a good society. So it's not dialectical tension. It is these institutions that are purposeful and purposefully designed from God's perspective that in their interaction with one another help society stay balanced on what's most important.
So you've got this idea, the neo-Calvinist Kuyperian idea of sphere sovereignty on one side, and then you have the Marxist understanding of society on the other hand.
Yeah. And there is a Catholic theology that fits into this as well. The idea of subsidiarity.
Mhm.
It says that the problems of society are most likely to be solved by people who are closest to the problem. Now, if you look at how Marxism always ends up working out economically, it tries to concentrate power in the highest form, in the federal government or whatever. Whereas the Catholic idea was put that pressure downward if a community in Colorado has a problem, they don't ask somebody sitting in a cubicle in Washington, D.C. to solve it for them. They
Right.
figure out how to solve it themselves. So even in some, in Catholic social theory, uh, you have a way of approaching this issue that makes much more sense than what Marxists came up with.
This is rabbit trailing just slightly, but you have the Christian, quote unquote, Christian idea of government. When you look at the Christian Middle Ages, would you classify that as true Christian governance? Or was that in some sense a perversion? Do you think that worked?
Yeah. Well, it's hard to pinpoint any moment that I would say, freeze that, that's the right way to do it.
Right.
There were obviously a number of moments in Geneva with Calvin in charge that were positive, some that were oppressive. Society is always in a state of flux, so you're always having to make adjustments and try to find justice. I think the church, I'm referring to the Roman Catholic Church, in the Middle Ages had an outsized influence, and it was largely because of disease and death. If you look back at the Black Death, the bubonic plague, sometimes half the people in a town would die. 2/3 of the people in a town would die. It's unreal. So obviously civil government collapsed. Basic systems of sewage and water and crop production and all those things all collapsed. The church stepped in to become an organizing force. But rather than rebalancing once the crisis was over, it continued to grow in its power and influence. And because it had a vested interest in making sure that things stayed the way church leaders wanted them to be, but also because everyday people, once they turn over their authority, they aren't really that willing to take it back because it's a lot of hard work.
Right. There's also this interesting idea posited by historical fiction author Bernard Cornwell, who's pretty atheistic in his writing. But you read on his website, and he says that the church is the only institution that allowed men to climb in medieval society without having to go to war and prove their valor. So naturally, that kind of power attracts the most ambitious and power-hungry young men from a society.
I think that's profound. I can see it in the economic world. So you've got these people who love to create things and win. Would you rather that they do that in the economic world and just go out and buy themselves private jets and yachts? Or would you rather that the political world is the only route to success and their way to dominate is by controlling everybody else around them through political structures? Marxism only ever gives you that second alternative.
That's interesting because I never thought about that before. It's like we don't want the rich people, but on the other hand, there's now only one way to become super powerful.
Yes.
Take
Yeah.
over
The
the government.
conflating factor in a place like America today is that we do have a very interventionist central government. So people who want to succeed in business realize they can make better products, but they could also go get a law passed through Congress that benefits them in their particular industry, and you end up with crony capitalism.
Right.
So, we've got to be aware. You can't just say, "Oh, capitalism is all good and there's no exception to it." No, remember, you're always rebalancing the family, the church, and the state. And when things get out of whack, it's the responsibility of every person. Martin Luther King said, "The arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice." And I was reading a book recently where the author said, yes, it bends toward justice, but there have to be people willing to do the bending.
And then one last question before we wrap up. Talked about Marxist view of dialectical materialism and economic determinism as their lens for viewing history. By contrast, how should a Christian look at history? How should a Christian look at the past?
Yeah, well, history is primarily your understanding of the flow of time. So you take a 24-hour day times all of the other days that have occurred and the days that we imagine will occur in the future, what is the meaning of it all? And obviously, some people say there is no meaning. What's the quote from Henry Ford? History's just one damn thing after another, right? There's no meaning to it. But a biblical view is there's very much meaning. There was a creation. Jesus came into the world as a person. There has been a redemption, a turning backward of death, and now we're moving toward the kingdom of God. And the kingdom of God, we pray, is modeled here in our own world, but we also look forward to a day when Jesus returns. And I'm not going to get into the rapture and the second coming and all of that, but the Revelation 20, 21, and 22 are quite clear that at the end of all things, God comes to make his dwelling with his people, and he will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. It is that hope that keeps us from being too overly discouraged when things aren't going well right now. You see the relationship. So what is the relationship? Well, the past can't be changed. The future can't really be molded nearly as much as we would like. What we have is this present moment. But how do we live in this present moment? In view, with memory, in view of the lessons from the past, and with hope, in view of God's ultimate plan. So the Christian view of history is utterly unique.
There's a sense in which the theology is the study of God, and then history is the study of God's actions in time.
In time, yes. Yeah. So one of the ways you see this in Scripture is in the Greek language, which is where the original manuscripts of the New Testament were in this language, Koine or Kine Greek. And it is characteristic that there are two views of time. One view, which is the chronos view, clock time, like a chronograph or chronological. And the other one is kairos, which is opportunity time. So chronos deals with the minutes, kairos deals with the moments. That's why Paul says, make the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. The days are evil, but the moments, the opportunities you have transform the minutes into something more. It's not just that you live a certain number of minutes and then you die and, that's it. But there's something bigger and deeper. So it's not that Christians should be trying to escape away to heaven. It's that they're wanting to pray that God will bring heaven here.
Well, thanks so much for doing this podcast, for joining me on the podcast today. It's been wonderful to talk with you about Marxism and Christian view of history.
Well, thanks, Will. It's been fun to get to know you. Glad you're here at the Summit Gap Year, and I'm really excited about your podcast and wish you the very best.
Well, thanks so much. That wraps up the latest edition of the world's one and only apologetic satire podcast without much satire. Thanks so much for tuning in.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode of the Rock Solid Apologia podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, go ahead and like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Also, go ahead and share with us in the comments how you found out about us. We'll see you next time on the next episode of the Rock Solid Apologia podcast.